Welcome to Kettlebell Corner, where strength meets theory, where we take you on a deeper dive into all things kettlebells. And today, we want to know, Roger, what's the core built for? Are you training it wrong? Are you even training it? If we think of our body as a system and your core is the glue, Roger, how sticky is it? That was kind of gross. But we're going to cover 3 types of core training, answer some common questions about that belly area, and leave you a sample set of exercises that you can use that'll probably make you better at kettlebells and life in general. I'm Jeremiah Waylon. He's Roger Parks. And right now, while I have your attention, please be sure to like, subscribe, follow, and it helps us get out to people that like this type of stuff. Roger?
Yes.
What's up?
Yo,
I like that. Nice and simple. All right. I alluded to it in that little intro thing, and it's talking about core training as glue. And I want to know, you presented this sort of idea, and I want to know, what the hell are we even talking about? Like, I feel glued together as it is. Is it because of my core?
No,
I'm not.
You're not.
I'm
definitely
unhinged.
not because of your core.
Okay. It's my Midwest upbringing. Tell me about the glue. Core training as glue.
Let's backtrack quickly so we don't need to run over this again. I don't want to be an obnoxious asshole. And well, again. I can't help it, but I don't want to be one of these people. We'll talk about what this means. I don't want to be one of these people that says core. What is even the core? Like, that's a stupid term. I don't think that's true. So we need to talk about what we mean. We need to have an operational definition. But what I do want to be obnoxious about is this idea. What is it built for? Okay, we all have our pet peeves in fitness. This is one of my pet peeves in fitness. It's like, we weren't designed for this. We weren't designed for that. Okay, that's stupid. If we can do it, we were designed for it. Yeah, you weren't there. So
didn't make me.
We will talk about some ideas of what this mystical area can do, but I wanna get that out of the way. If you think that this was built for that or this was built for this, I think that you are in error, and I think that you are limiting your opportunities and your possibilities. And I really think that you should rethink this idea of what this is built for. Anyhow, so let's talk about what the core is. There are some people who just sit there smugly and, make fun of the term and blah, blah, blah. I'm smarter than you, feel bad because of it. We don't want to do that. Let's come up with, let's talk about the muscles of the midsection. Let's call it that. Let's talk about the front, the back, the side. So the front core, the back core, the side core. All of the cores. Use the back core. We should also include muscles like the pelvic floor and the diaphragm as well. So
we're going deep.
Sure. I mean, there's merit in this idea that what is a core? Like, where do you draw these separations? Where are these delineations? And there's some merit there, but I don't think it's very practical. So let's just talk about, when we're talking about core here, we're talking specifically about muscles that are either designed to stabilize or mobilize, meaning move the spine. Is that fair? Like, how about we just limit it to that?
Okay. Yeah, that works. So the quads are out.
Well, there are some big ones that, can get a little debatable. You get into the lat, for example, that covers a large portion of the spine. It attaches directly to the fascia that it turns into the lower body, and most people don't treat it as though it's a core muscle. I've heard some people want it to be included as such. Your lats are definitely one of those muscles that you'll engage to keep things locked down when you're doing, let's say, a heavy deadlift. If you don't have lat activation, you're not going to be able to get very heavy. But from my understanding, and I'm not claiming to have any expertise, but from my understanding, the muscles that are deeper surrounding the spine are comprised of different fibers. They are slow twitch, meaning they're more made for endurance rather than strength or speed. And they're deeper as opposed to more superficial. So something like the lat, although it's going to be really helpful to anchor, it's also a very strong muscle in terms of moving, and it is more superficial. So let's throw that out and let's just use that as our definition going forward. You good with that?
I like it. It helps simplify things. So
okay,
now we go. Are you going to list all those muscles, or are we just going to just say that those are them?
No.
Okay, all right. This is an anatomy podcast. Jesus.
It's not. But those are some areas that you want to look at. You want to look at all the muscles that are surrounding the spine. You want to look at the pelvic floor, and you want to look at the diaphragm. Those are the things that you'll need to make sure that the spine is stable or mobile or whatever you want to call it. So back to this idea. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Well, back to this idea of glue, right?
Yeah.
So I think of core training as you have just finished, you're making a model. I like stupid analogies. Here's another one for you. You punched out all the little plastic pieces. Did you ever do this? Did you ever make a model?
Oh yeah. Of course.
Okay.
Painted it.
Guess how many models I finished in my life?
0.
Exactly none. Never, not one.
Roger,
not only
guess
that,
how many I finished?
7.
2.
Okay.
It was a Camaro and I think it was like an F-15 or something like that.
I didn't even have models that had all the pieces in them.
Nice.
I remember I was little. We would go to the thrift store, and I wanted to just buy random stuff because that's what I had the bucks for, right? So I'd go and I'd pick up the box, and you never know. You get most of the way through, like, oh, don't have this piece. Anyhow, so you punch out all these pieces, right? And you put them together, and then you're supposed to glue them to stay in place. That assumes that the doors aren't on upside down. You're not missing a tire. You don't put the front bumper on the back and the back on the front. It assumes that everything's where it ought to be. That's this glue analogy. So when you're getting into training, we're getting to this idea of reinforcement. That doesn't necessarily mean immobilization or stabilization. It doesn't mean necessarily locking things down. It just means that if you are going to do something to cement something in place or glue something or reinforce position or the way it fires, it ought to be in the right spot. Otherwise, you're going to have a model that's like mine, unfinished, and you basically throw it away. So you want to consider position, whatever your philosophy of core training is.
Okay. Well, I probably would have returned that model as a donation back to said thrift store until they figured it out. All right. So that covers the glue. We talked about the musculature. We define where that area is. I'm kind of guilty of this. Sometimes I train core as often as I should. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I only hop on an abs class when one of my trainer buddies has one going on Zoom. Shout out. How often should people be training this core? I mean, aren't deadlifts and squats with kettlebells and barbells enough, Roger? Bait?
Well, so here's I don't want to get too much into the frequency debate, and I know this is a big question, but it's too context dependent. What I will say about this is I can offer an opinion, and that opinion is anecdotal. I don't know if this has been studied. If it has, I haven't seen it. But the idea of, I don't need to do core. I do squats. I do deadlifts. I don't believe it. And I've never heard, not one time, a strong athletic person say that. I've never heard, oh, well, I don't need to train my midsection because I squat and I deadlift. I see elite athletes. I see the strongest people in the world. I see people who are really excelling, doing some sort of targeted, specific work for that midsection to focus on how the spine functions and operates. And we'll get into some different ways that might be. But that's a notion that I fundamentally reject. Even if you think about the anatomical differences between the superficial musculature and the deep musculature, are you using your deep muscles? Sure. Every time you're picking up anything, you have to use your core. And you can get some incidental work, no question about it. And if you're looking at, let's say, you're doing construction or, you're doing a lot of farm work, then yeah, you can do that. But there's a lot of bending and lifting and carrying and things involved that are not just force output. Squatting, deadlifting, that's force output. And when you look at the anatomy, if my conceptions are correct, the anatomy of your superficial movers that will help you squat and deadlift, they are different than the muscles that stabilize your spine. And the spinal stabilizers are slower twitch and they're more endurance oriented, which means that they take longer. And many people don't do sets of squats or deadlifts, especially with any serious load, long enough to get what would be a training benefit. So either A, you're doing these for a long time and you're underloading them, which means that your squat sucks and your deadlift sucks, and you're probably not doing enough to overload these muscles and challenge them in order to get a better position, or you are doing that and you're not doing it long enough to have a core training benefit, which is why, kettlebells within the system do have some let's call them core training options, like carries. Carries are fantastic as one of their main functions, and we'll get into that. The notion that I'm doing enough, I've never heard a strong person make that claim, ever, one time.
So you just made the perfect case for those planks, because if you want to get that endurance, you gotta do those planks, right? Hold those for a little bit longer, or what? Are we talking like that? And how does the hard style plank that is so popular in the beginning, especially of people's kettlebell journeys, does that play into that? Is that going to cover what we're talking about, or is like crunches enough?
Well, again, we get into things like context, and spoiler alert, I'm not going to give very many specific answers, because the ones that I've had, I'm very skeptical of very specific numbers.
Yeah.
And there are some who have attempted to do that, but you get into, a lot of people think planks are absolute nonsense. Planks aren't going to help you do anything. Well, maybe they will. If you need to create a situation where your midsection, your rib cage needs to stay stacked over your pelvis, and you need a challenging but safe and low threat way to do that, then I would say, even if it's just from a neurological standpoint, that can provide some benefit. Will it be your best movement? I don't know. Personally, I like doing what I call a standing plank, which is, holding a kettlebell in front of me and lifting it forward just a little bit. It trains the same muscles in a way that is more context specific, because usually when I want to get stronger, I'm doing it on my feet. And later on, when we come up with a list of some of the moves we like, we'll get into this idea. But, the strong first plank, I think, is useful for a variety of ways. And this is where we're going to start getting some nuance, is this idea of strengthen this for that benefit, I think, is incomplete. I think a strong first plank gives you the experience of creating tension, which is important. Does that train the muscles? Probably. But more importantly, it trains the brain. You're participating in an act of coordination. And that is very important when it comes to strength. So even if, the EMG doesn't necessarily say this is going to do that, even if it's not necessarily long enough, it's still going to be beneficial. And that's where you start to get a little fuzzy with some of this stuff.
Yeah, I like that. Teaches you how to coordinate. And that's like when you said that, it's like a light bulb goes off, because that's exactly what it does. Teaches you how to get tight really quick for a short amount of time, 15, 20 seconds or whatever, and then relax, which is, I guess, part of the essence of kettlebell training, is that tension, relaxation, juxtaposition. And this probably goes without saying, but you can't really target your belly fat with core training. It just goes on with the kitchen.
Not that I'm aware of.
And I want to talk about a couple of types, Roger. I want to talk about stability and mobility. All right. So we got a couple of areas to cover. I, for one, and I'm going to introduce the Stuart McGill approach first. And I assume this is the stability portion. This is something where he has a big three. I think it's the big three, Roger. And this is something that I personally, and you've been with me for like a dozen years now. I've had issues with my back and all sorts of things, and those big three came in really handy. But let's start and talk about these approaches, the stability and the mobility approach. And let's start with stability. And what are we talking about here?
The stability approach, you mentioned Stu McGill, and as far as I know, he's the biggest proponent of that.
Mustache and all.
Glorious mustache.
Glorious.
I don't think that Stu McGill gets his due, and I think that he really does get misunderstood a lot. A very reductive version of what he says is Stu McGill hates spinal flexion, says you should never flex your spine. That's not what he says. That's not what he says at all. But what he does say is that the activities that you might be engaged in, where you're most likely to injure yourself, often happen when your spine is moving and you don't have control over it. So if you can create stability, a platform from which to move your limbs, you are likely going to protect yourself. This gets into this camp. And I remember years ago, people like Greg Cook and Mike Boyle talking about joint by joint. And, these joints are meant for this and these joints are meant for that. Even, you look at the individual segments of the spine, the lumbar spine is big and it's meant for stability. It's not necessarily meant to move. I think we go maybe a bridge too far with some of that stuff. A lot of that stuff I think is kind of gimmicky horseshit. And I just don't buy it. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen enough other than, anecdotes and, clever sayings coming out of that camp. So, there may be some merit there, but I do think that there is, and this is what I want to hammer home. I do think that there's a tremendous benefit for some activities in learning how to control your spine. Meaning when I pick things up, not just am I moving through the joints where I ought to move. Okay. That was actually, if we really get down to the source of your back pain, the biggest source of your back pain was that you were moving through your spine rather than your legs.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And, we'll talk about that in future episodes, but ultimately the gist of it was, instead of pushing my legs into the ground to complete deadlift swings and these sorts of things, I was driving it with just a complete shoulders first approach. You know what I mean?
Spinal
I was
extension.
thinking about the end. Yeah, I was thinking about the end and not about the process.
Sure.
That makes
So,
sense.
those muscles got strong over time and your spine didn't move all that well, but it didn't prevent you from hurting yourself. So, this idea that you should be able to stabilize your spine, I think is valid. I think it's worthwhile. If there's a position that you need to be in and you need control in that position, then I think you ought to train that. And I think that seems pretty self-evident. And I don't think that's a big claim to make. So in that, if that's the case, then first things first, do you have the capacity to get in the right position? So let's say theoretically for a squat or a deadlift, I need to be able to keep my rib cage stacked over my pelvis. Okay. So can I do that to some degree of effectiveness? And then how do I execute movements where I am layering on some kind of tension, whether it be an external load like a weight or a kettlebell or something like that, or a band, or just using gravity? Because all too often, if you've been in the gym for 10 minutes, you've seen somebody doing a plank where their belly button's scraping the floor. And
Sweet.
Okay, well, you're holding it and you're training the muscles, but you're not in the right position. So when you start thinking about this stuff like glue, right? Is that really the position you want to glue yourself in?
Right. This sort of saggy, not aligned position. That's what you're training right there. Is that what you're getting at?
And it's really important to note when you do have extreme misalignment, you start sacrificing motion. If your ribs are not over your hips, okay, if you don't have, and that really comes down to the pelvic floor and the diaphragm, the thoracic diaphragm being lined up. If you don't have these two diaphragms in line, then you have some tipping. You have either some flexion or extension or twisting of the spine, or you have some sort of flexion and extension of the hips, which means that you are giving away range of motion at the midsection. So not only are you giving away something that's meant to be protective of the spine, meaning quality hip motion, but you're gluing yourself in a position where you're not going to be very strong. Right. If you look at this idea, people talk about rib flare where the ribs are lifted up.
Yeah.
If you're in that position chronically, then your abdominal wall, it's lengthened, right? You're walking around and some of these muscles are lengthened and you don't have a lot of leverage really to close them. So you're trying to get strong in that position, but what you need to do is get position first and then get strong in that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And then subsequently, if you're like somebody who's like kind of like scrunched down all the time, that's going to be the inverse reaction. Obviously, you want to fix that position as well.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned this, and I don't know if there's anybody whose credit is due for this, but the breathing exercises, is that going to would that constitute core training if you're doing specific breathing? I know when we did the human matrix, that was something that was covered a lot as far as like positioning and positional breathing. And that's Zach Couples' human matrix. Shout out, fam. Is that something that we can consider core training? Is that somewhere where you should start? as far as your stability, or just like have it as a mix in a passive sort of way?
If I'm starting anyone anywhere, yeah. So right now I'm working on finishing up a swing book. And when I talk about finding these muscles in the midsection and finding position, I use breathing, because when you, I believe the term is expiratory reserve volume. Okay. We have
dumb it down for this. All right.
we have a certain amount of air that's going to be trapped in our lungs at all times. And when we breathe in, breathe out normally, our muscles are not going to be really involved in that. But if we're trying to get out more air than normal, right, it's going to require some muscles in that midsection around the spine that are actually going to squeeze. Okay, they're gonna squeeze to kind of push some of that air out that's normally in there. So we don't think about that normally, right? So you can do this as you're sitting here now. If you're exhaling, okay, and you're continuing to go exhale, 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 at some point you should feel the muscles of your midsection engage, because in order to keep getting that air out, you need something to provide a squeeze, right? Because the atmosphere we're in has pressure. And that's going to push down on us. It's going to push in automatically to any vacuum we have. So when the diaphragm drops, when we breathe in, the air is going to come into the lungs and it's just going to fill it. So something's got to push it out, right? So if you're going to get a good exhale at some point, the muscles of the midsection are going to give a squeeze. Now, there's another way to do this too, and that's with breathing in. And this is where you get into things like squatting and deadlifting. When you breathe in, what you might find is a reflexive tightening of the muscles, because the air that's filling up the thoracic cavity, right? It's going to push down into your guts, which are going to push into the sides of the muscles where the spine is, and you're going to get a reflexive midsection contraction there. So, if you do what's called the power breath for kettlebells, right, where you jam your thumbs into your sides and you exhale forcefully, that's going to be more of that first one you're going to feel. But if you take a really, really big breath of air in, you should feel the muscles of the sides contract. So either way, breathing in, breathing out, you can get to both ways, but breath is going to be a great way to become attuned to that midsection, and it's going to help you get position as well.
So it's worthy to do that daily. All right. I like that. So does that cover the stability for the most part that we want to go into on this? Or is there anything you want to add to that before?
I think so. The only thing that I find a little bit fishy about this whole idea is one of the cutesy little things that people talk about is, you can't fire a cannon from a canoe. Okay. Well, maybe you can, maybe you can't. Again, I like analogies. That one's funny. A cannon? Okay. That one's funny. But there's when you look at the way people actually move, okay, when you look at when you get into physics and motion and things like that, we have kinematics, which is how things look, and kinetics, which is how forces are actually produced. And when you get into how forces are actually produced, it's very rare that you have a rigid frame and things are moving around that frame when you're actually getting into athletics. Now, that situation is very commonly true with exercise, right? If you look at a squat or a deadlift, absolutely, you should see a pretty rigid frame and moving around that. But other than lifting, even when you get into things like kettlebell lifting, or you get into Olympic lifting, it's a lot more dynamic, and you don't see you see some of those concepts, but more often when you get into athletic movement, you start to see a ton of rotation. Okay, you see both sides of the body doing different things, and think of something as just as ferocious as like a pitch in baseball, right? You got a ton of twisting and rotation and movement in all three planes that's going on. So this whole stability thing can be useful, but how useful is it in this situation? And I don't know, maybe it's useful in order to keep you safe in the weight room, to be able to lift the weights you need to use to get strong enough to be a top level pitcher. Okay. That might be fine.
It's not adding benefit to my pickleball game, I'll tell you that much.
But when we get into the idea of when we get into the idea of real athleticism, there's a lot of movement going on there. And I'm not entirely sure that this let's keep everything locked down is the way to go. And that's, that brings us to, another approach that people have to core training.
It's that mobility style, right? Something where you're loading flexion or rotation of stuff? Is that what you're
flexion, rotation? That? Yeah. Flexion, rotation, extension. And the idea as far as I know it, the load is a different thing. I haven't dug into this a lot, but my understanding is that the spine to some degree needs to go through the motions it needs to go through, or it can go through in order to stay healthy. Okay. So flexion, extension, rotation. That doesn't necessarily mean that load is required for that, but the thought is, you get things like, if you know what a Jefferson curl is, where you get people who will, they'll usually stand on a box or something like that, and they will flex their spine under load. And the idea there is it's prophylactic. Let me get strong in the positions that I might actually be in. So if you're an athlete who requires, a lot of twisting or a lot of flexion or extension, then there may be some benefit to actually loading that spine through a range of motion. Now that load is not going to be as heavy as, let's say your squat or your deadlift. You see people doing things like good mornings, which is kind of like a hybrid approach. It's definitely a lot of stability, but you are loading that spine more directly. So these approaches are a little different than the first approach, which is let me just kind of lock everything down. Even if you're moving, even if you're doing a carry, you don't want to have, your spine wobbling around. Yeah. This would be more of like, your Jefferson curl, or like, people call them Russian twists, where you get a plate and you're actively twisting side to side.
I think any exercise that was painful, they use like an Eastern European name, like Russian twist, Bulgarian split squat, Turkish get up with no.
So, are those my favorite exercises? No, but I do know of a lot of high level, very strong people, who are great athletes who have done these things. And I can't say for certain, maybe they've succeeded in spite of these things. It's possible, but I do think that there is a valid approach to, using load to inoculate yourself against the things that you're worried about. And if you can attain the right position, which many people can't, so I don't think this is right for everybody. I actually don't think it's right for most people. But if you can do that, if you're a high level athlete, then, it might be worthwhile. I was watching, people, especially trainers, will scoff at this, like, oh, you're an idiot. Your spine is meant to be stable, not mobile. But I was watching just the other day, a very, very high level Chinese Olympic lifter who had a barbell on his back, and he was twisting. He was doing side bends side to side, and he at least had 135 pounds on that bar. It wasn't, it wasn't nothing, but this guy was a monster. He was extremely strong. He was extremely muscular, and he's extremely high level. So, when I see stuff like that, when I was younger, the arrogance was, oh, well, that guy's an idiot, but maybe he's not. Maybe I'm the idiot. Maybe he knows something I don't.
Maybe I better stop calling names and forming judgments about people. All right. Sure. This is therapy now too. What about, okay, I have two questions about movement and loading that. So back to the Chinese athlete who's loading with the barbell. So let's say I have a kettlebell in my right hand. Am I doing those like little side bends? You know what I'm talking about? Are those, is that loading mobility? Is that sort of fall into that camp? And I don't know if we're going to talk about that in our exercises, but
I think it would. And, I don't have a scenario where I would recommend it. I'm not saying I would recommend it. I would recommend against it. But I don't have specific examples where that's something that I do. But I do want to put it out there that it does seem to be a valid approach for some people. But I also at the same time want to walk back and say, hey, this is not my expertise. I don't train, I train some striking, okay, punching, kicking. I get a lot of loaded, rotation on my spine, but it's not loaded with weights. It's loaded with, my fists and my feet. Right. So that's sufficient load, but I don't know, that may be valid, but that is what we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, there's going to be a difference, though, when you look at the moment arm and actually directly training your spine. There's going to be a magnitudes of order difference when you have a bell down by your
here,
hip. Exactly,
and when it's
right.
way down low.
Yeah, when you have something that high up on your spine, then you're using the entire lever, the entire length of your spine, and that's a lot of torque. And clearly the person doing it is doing it for a reason.
Handle it. Yeah, and they can handle it.
Sure.
Now, we talked about in the last episode, different types of things that you should use to round out your kettlebell training, and one of them was the Mace 360s, and this is something we both do. But I'm curious about this because sometimes I do it where I'm like kind of moving with it. Sometimes I do it where I'm trying to stay nice and rigid. Would that be like loading mobility in the spine if you're hitting those Mace 360s heavy enough? Or is that not specific enough core training and moving on?
That's an interesting question. So would I put it in the loaded spinal training column? I would not. But there is a third classification that we're going to get into, and that's probably where I would put that.
Yeah, let's get into it right now.
Well, hold on.
Yeah. Okay. I'm excited.
I think that there are merits, though, doing Mace 360s. And for me, it's very load dependent. So if I'm starting off, I've got a 20-pound mace and I'll do some 360s. And it's all, I feel it more shoulders and actually ankles. Okay, those will get a little stiff. But as soon as I go up to the bigger one, I've got a 30-pounder. And as soon as I start using that, I feel a lot of oblique. I feel a lot of midsection on my sides. So I will alternate situations where I am both staying really, really rigid in order to learn how to lock down my spine and move around that. Okay. And the mace is moving around me. And then I will also go into a situation where I'm letting the mace move me a little bit. I'm moving side to side, and I'm generating some of that force with my movement. And I think both are valid approaches. They both feel good, and I feel like I get benefit from doing both. But again, so let's talk about the that. Do you want to talk about the third way of thinking about things?
Yeah, Sergei Grashevsky. Did I say that right? Sergei?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think
that's accurate. I think it's accurate.
Whatever.
I think I'm from that neck of the woods. We're talking about the spinal engine theory, Roger.
We are. And maybe you said that perfectly. I've never heard it pronounced that way, so maybe I'm just hearing it mispronounced by everybody else. Okay. Either way.
How do they say it?
I always hear Grakovetsky.
Comrade.
Grakovetsky is what I've heard.
How did Pavel say it?
I didn't ask him. We'll call him after this.
Call him.
Yeah, call him right now. Anyway, I don't know, but there's this guy. His last name starts with a G. And
call Mr. G from here on out.
He has this idea. He calls it the spinal engine, and that is rather than looking at the spine as just kind of a bridge between things like ground reaction force and where you're generating force with your legs up to your hands or your arms or whatever, rather than looking at the spine as just a means of transmitting power, it's a meaningful contributor to power. And my understanding is that he got some video of some people moving who didn't have arms or legs. And when he was watching this, the idea was that, well, they look remarkably similar to people walking normally. Therefore, these people don't have arms and legs, and therefore the spine must be a useful contributor. Now, again, I haven't gone into this very deep. Based on that, it is problematic in that, well, if you're just basing your videos off of people who have no other option than to move a particular way, maybe they're just using the structural constraints of how the rib cage and the pelvis are attached with the spine, and it looks similar because that's how humans actually walk.
Right.
So, either way, I do think that there's probably something in the theory that bears paying attention to, and that's this idea that your spine is active, right? It's not just a thing that's along for the ride, that you can use it. You can use it to help generate force. So when you watch, I talked about, well, I don't know anything about baseball. I'll talk about punching. I know about punching.
Okay. Hit me.
I have never seen, and actually you see this with beginners. Okay. You see this with beginners who don't know how to punch at all, and they're very rigid. There's no rotation. There's no power from the legs at all. And it's just a lot of, my midsection stiff, and I'm going to stick my arm straight out, and it's a silly
Hopefully
little
you run
non-punch,
into it.
right? When you get good at this, you start to see this really tremendous push down into the floor. Okay. Some people will pivot on the feet. Some people won't. Either way, the force, let's say I'm throwing a straight right, you'll see a bunch of force will start to come up through the legs and will rotate the pelvis and the spine, the lumbar spine into the rib cage. And then last, the arm is going to move forward. And that is not a passive spinal position. The spine goes through a tremendous amount of rotation. And I think it would be at least naive to assume that the spine is just completely passive in that situation, because it certainly doesn't look passive. And it certainly doesn't look anything like a plank or like a suitcase deadlift, right? Or a carry where you're keeping everything locked down and rigid. And it's also not this idea of, well, you're pivoting through the hips and you're not pivoting through the spine. If you watch people who are really good at punching, that everything goes in segments. It goes from the ground up, and things will twist by degrees. And if you are keeping your spine completely rigid and you're not twisting, your rib cage doesn't change shape, you're going to be missing out on a tremendous amount of force generation or power, people might say. So
probably get your ass kicked too.
Probably.
Yeah.
Not to mention, things like range of motion and blah, blah, blah. But I do think that it is useful to think about the spine as something that contributes meaningfully to movement. So there are situations where I will certainly train it with maybe a throw or a slam or something like that. And I'm not isolating the spine, but the spine becomes a meaningful part of the movement. So if I'm doing my heavier Mace 360, right, as I'm going, I might start with more of my weight on one foot and then shift to the other side. And I'll feel my midsection and I'll feel my sternum, my torso start to rotate a little bit. And it becomes a part of the movement. So it's not a deliberate where I feel like I'm just doing a crazy, it doesn't feel like a Jefferson curl. It feels a little different. It feels very fluid, and it feels as though my spine becomes active in the movement rather than just kind of hanging out, either being completely rigid or moving on its own. There's some kind of synchronization going on with all of my body parts that makes the movement more meaningful. And I do think that is another way to think about core training. And depending upon what you need in your life and in your sport, if you have sports you play, you're going to probably want to evaluate each of these three methods of core training and say, hey, do I need this or not? I do think that you need some rather than just squats and deadlifts, but what exactly do you need? That's going to be context dependent.
Well, and then with that spinal engine theory and sort of that movement thing, we've dabbled in the, and maybe you more than me, I got a couple moves down, but those RMT ropes, those like flow rope sort of things, is that going to be kind of based on that same principle? Because like it seemed to me when we did it, it was a lot more movement through there without the extremities contributing as much as you'd think. I don't know.
I think that it's definitely, I think that you can use the rope as a feedback mechanism to show whether or not you are effective at generating force and rotation. Does it train those patterns? I don't know that it necessarily trains them the way we might think of, let's say, a plank would, right? Mm-hmm. Or a Jefferson curl. But I do think that going back to the beginning when we talked about this idea of coordinating, right? I had you use the flow rope because you're stiff. Yeah. And there was no coordination between your upper and your lower body. And going back to this perpetual problem of you getting that press up, I wanted your whole body alive and working.
Yeah.
So, hey, let's see if we can get you a little looser and let's see if we can find those connections. Interesting thing, when you look at just from a physics approach, right? When you look at what energy does, and energy has to flow through things. Okay. If you're watching somebody and they're clunky and they're not moving well, or if they're making a lot of sound,
like my sprinting.
Yes. Well, you're more of like a side to side sprinter. Um, you don't have effective force transfer. You just don't. If things are loose, if like, let's say your muscles are always really tight, that doesn't mean you're bad at producing force. It just means that force transfer through different segments of your body are not going to be great. So you get power lifters, right? These are the strongest people on earth, but you start getting them into, it was actually pretty funny. I saw, two strongmen, Eddie Hall and the Icelandic guy. I think he's Icelandic. The world record, that Bjornsson guy. I saw them.
The mountain.
Yeah, I saw them. I saw them boxing. I think, or was it? I don't know. If they were kicking.
I remember
not.
that. Yeah, I think they were faking it, but not
no,
like a Logan Paul
I'm
thing.
sure. I'm sure if you get hit by these guys, it'll hurt. But I would not call anything either of them did in the ring coordinated.
Yeah,
like it just wasn't, because they're used to training their bodies in a particular way. For them to be that good at what they're good at, right? Especially someone like Eddie Hall. Eddie Hall is a lot trimmer than when he was really training, serious strongman stuff, right?
Yeah.
But still, these guys, although you don't want to get hit by them,
no,
right?
They're monsters. 900 on the punching machine.
They were not coordinated, and you could see that energy did not flow as freely through their bodies because that's not what they were training for. They're training to, really stabilize a huge amount of load. So this is where this gets context dependent. But going back to the rope, the rope for you was really just a means of how do you integrate your upper and lower body. So for that, there were movement lessons that you needed to learn. And would that bring those muscles on? Like, would it bring them online? Sure. And could you maybe feel like sore in your obliques or your midsection after doing that? Absolutely. But that doesn't necessarily, I don't know if it qualifies for training them or it doesn't. I don't really care. If you have a force component when it comes to training and you have a learning component. So if the learning component reinforces your ability to stabilize better or to synchronize better, and that translates into the desired result, then I'd say that's training.
Wow, that's really well-rounded. You're a well-rounded trainer. All right. Thanks for sharing that information.
Uh-huh.
Let's talk a little bit of specifics and send these people on their way, Roger. I want to load a few of these things, and I know you have some favorite movements that you force me to do sometimes and that I enjoy doing on my own sometimes. Use your imagination. But what are some of your favorite ways to load maybe stability, some of the mobility or some movement kind of paired up core stuff? What do we got here? What are some of your favorite patterns?
I'd say if I were to pick my absolute favorite, it's a barbell suitcase deadlift. So I'll just get a couple 45s on the bar, and that's more for the height, right? Mm-hmm. The load, sometimes I load it up a little more, but not. I don't go crazy with it. But I'll bend down, I'll put it right next to me, I'll grab it in the middle, and I'll do some deadlifts. And I will stand up nice and long at the top. And, 135 pounds is substantial enough where I feel that weight wants to move back down. And I really have to activate my sides laterally in order to keep that from happening. So that one is really paid off well for me. It translates, I think, into my kettlebells pretty well too, because you get that lateral stability. And, one thing that when we coach, kettlebells, especially if we're working with someone on a one arm swing or a snatch, is we'll remind them that they need to stay same side heavy. So if you're doing a right arm, one arm swing, then I will say same side heavy, which means keep your weight in your right leg, because that's what you need to push off of. Sometimes people will start to move away from the load just to balance it. But when you move away from the load to balance it, so if you have a right or a kettlebell in your right hand and you're moving left, excuse me, to help you stay balanced, you're also going to not have your weight in that foot, and your force transfers are going to not be as good. So this has helped for that. So that I would say, if I were to pick one, if I were to pick a favorite, that does a lot for me. What about you?
That sounds hard. I'm going to add it to my list too. Okay. Personally, I find myself more often than not in my core specific training doing the hanging leg raises stuff. Right now it's a lot more hanging like knee lifts for me. But progression with everything, I suppose. And I like a mix between that, and I still do like the classic 1980s ab wheel. I still like that one. So those are probably like the two that I enjoy doing the most. I do like some of the landmine rotation stuff. In fact, because Amazon is, a certain store owned that everybody shops at is having a huge sale. I'm getting a little holder thing for my barbell.
What did you get, like the little plastic ball that goes on the end?
Yeah, I wanted the little ball. I have the one that can go in the plates, but I'm really just about efficiency. I have an extra barbell. I can leave it set up with that on there, and it's not a big deal. And it's out of the way. So I'm going to get one of those. And, I really, since we started doing those, and we did start doing those a few years back to kind of, I think it was to get stronger for said press, in our cycle of putting up maximum presses every couple of years. And we were doing some of those landmine rotations where your arms are nice and straight. You're driving from that ground up and twisting through. I would say like those are probably the ones that I gravitate toward the most, aside from I do enjoy carries, like rack carries I like a lot. That's going to be a stability one, I presume, with that. And then
but there's also some locomotion involved, so you're gonna get some stability while you're moving, and you don't have to do these necessarily in a particular way. You can let that bell swing a little bit. You don't need to go as heavy. Let it swing and see what happens.
Yeah, feel your body, right?
Yeah, going back to the landmine rotation, you can do them really, really rigid with arms that are completely locked out, and you're training a tremendous number of things. The moment arm, as it relates to the spine, is going to be very long. So there's going to be a lot of torque that you need to stabilize there. But just think your arms all the way down to your shoulders, your lats, your entire shoulder girdle needs to stabilize there. So you can do it that way. One way I like to do it is to really do a fair amount of twisting from the ground up. So it'll be a little more segmental. And I don't go as heavy with these, but I will mostly keep my spine stable, but I will allow a little bit of rotation in there. One thing though that I wanted to point out about the hanging leg raise, this is something that I really started paying more attention to when we did the body weight stuff with Oz, with our buddy Oz Aponte. Fantastic when it comes to body weight stuff. Strong First team leader. But one thing he pointed out is that we have so many patterns that we do that are an extension, that having something like this where we bring the spine back the other way and we feed that pattern, we provide the brain the stimulus that we need in order to get things reversed is really, really important. Even one kind of tricky thing, that this might be a little advanced for some people, but one thing that a lot of people don't get when you're looking at spinal flexion, one thing that people have a really hard time doing is actually bringing their guts back inside their body.
Like pulling them towards your spine, basically.
Exactly right. And when you're used to, let's say we'll call it the popular way to say it is an anterior tilt, right? So when the pelvis will tilt anteriorly, you have everything moving forward. Okay. And this is happening all day, every day. What will happen is your guts will not sit really well directly over the pelvic floor. They'll start to push forward into your abdominal wall. The abdominal wall will get lengthened. And sometimes when you see people who are relatively lean, yet they look like they've got bellies, it means that their guts are not necessarily sitting where they ought to be. And sometimes when we have too much extension, right, that low back those muscles get super tight, that's going to push all of that stuff forward. If you're a power lifter, you probably aren't worried about that all that much because you have this really strong weight belt that you can contract into most of the time. So you don't often notice that for some people. But when you go to bring that spine the other way, right, when you're going all the way, bringing your, hanging from your arms and bringing your toes all the way up to the bar, you need to make sure that your guts can actually move backwards. And that is,
they got to be out of the way.
Immediately, they got to get out of the way or your ribs can't close. When
That's
you bring your guts in, you're going to get immediately some spinal flexion. And one of the goofy things I do, there are many, but I love hanging upside down. I like hanging upside down.
Like the fucking Batman or something.
Well, no, I do the gravity boots and they feel really good. Some people have told me that I'm a dumb shit for doing it. I'm good with that. It's helped me. It feels good. But I will, without trying to deliberately flex my spine, I will focus on bringing my guts back in. And I get a crazy activation, crazy awareness in my midsection.
Oh, I bet, because you're working against the gravity at that point too.
Yeah. So, it's a different orientation than my body's used to. But the idea of that particular pattern is you're reversing something that you're doing so much of the opposite.
I love that. That's great. I'm going to do some right now. Also, real quick, another version of that, which I find very helpful, and you tell me if this sort of lines up, is one where you sort of get a heavier kettlebell and you lay down in front of it where the kettlebell's up towards your head, and you can kind of hold on those handles, and you're essentially reverse curling it up from there, flat on the ground. Like if you can't hang, because sometimes I just don't have a pull-up bar, I can't hang, and I'll use those, and I think that sort of accomplishes the same thing as well. So there's an option for you.
What you're looking at is a similar pattern. When you want to start someone on push-ups, I've had clients who, are in their 80s, and we have to start on the wall, right? Yeah. And when you think about what you're doing, you're just changing your relationship to gravity. So you get someone on the wall and they're doing some push-ups. Oh, that feels pretty good. Then maybe you bring them down to a high box. Oh, that feels good. Hey, try these on the back of your couch. And you're bringing someone down, and by the time you actually get them, on the ground doing push-ups, then that is going to be, unless you do like a foot elevated kind of thing, that is going to be the maximum amount that gravity is going to oppose you, right? So when you're thinking about that, the resistance of that movement is actually going to fall off at a certain point. It's going to fall off sooner than it would if you're hanging. Okay. Just because of your orientation relative to gravity. So when you're doing those, which I think they're awesome, you're going to find that the very beginning is going to be very hard, and in the middle is going to start to get a little bit easier. And at a certain point,
at the top, it's pretty easy.
It happens on its own as long as you have the mobility to go all the way over. Whereas if you're hanging, right, the gravity is, you're always opposing gravity. That actually the toes all the way up to the bar is going to be the hardest part.
Yeah. And trust me, it's hard. I can't even do it.
So, when you're thinking about that, you're right to think about, oh, is this the same pattern? Absolutely. But you can also play with this idea of gravity. How am I opposing gravity? And the more you can create a situation where you're opposing gravity directly, the harder the movement's going to be.
Is there anything you can't put physics into, Roger?
Probably, but I'm not.
Well, we can't cover it here. All right. All right. Is there anything else about the core? Is that it? Is that what we got?
No, I just, if we had specific examples, then we could definitely give people some, hey, you should do this, or you should do that, or you should try this. But I am of the opinion that squats and deadlifts are not enough. Even if you're doing your kettlebell swings, which we really didn't talk about, and you're doing like the heavy power breath at the top, I still don't think that's enough.
No, that feels just like you're supporting your movement as opposed to training specifically.
Sure. And that's the easiest part of the swing anyway. Like the bell is floating, it's weightless at that point. So, can you get by regular life without doing direct core training? Probably, as long as you're exercising. I do
plenty of people are alive.
Sure. But when you really get into peak efficiency and you get into, hey, I want to be as strong as possible. I think all people would benefit to doing some direct training. But if you really want to get elite level, you want to get strong, this idea that, oh, hey, I do squats and deadlifts is enough. I think it's stupid. So feel free to disagree.
Yeah. Disagree in the comments. Let us know what your core training is. And if you have some specific questions about, should I do this if I'm trying to do that, drop that in the comment too. We will reply. We're pretty good about that, and we welcome it. I'm going to go ahead and go do some medicine balls against the wall and some hanging leg raises for dinner, and then we're just going to move on from that. And thanks for listening. And as always, download the Bells app from the Apple App Store. It's free, for crying out loud, and there's plenty of programming in there from us, as well as a premium feature for low price that gets you about 15 to 20 workouts a month. No problem. And some of them have core. All right, Roger, anything else?
No, I think we could leave it. We could go on for hours, but I think we've I think we've got enough.
All right. Well, stay strong, everybody, and we'll see you next time.